Okay, well, I think it's a process which is almost certainly going to go on and to play out for quite a long period. European Union's Article 7 mechanism is quite slow, it's quite difficult to operate, and of course there are initiatives coming from Polish courts and tribunals asking the European Court of Justice to review cases. So I think we can expect to see the process taking some time because there aren't really any clear rules, and because the Article 7 process is a long and complicated one. So it's a long-term thing, I think. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the new commission seems to some extent to reflect the influence of the V4 states, who are sceptical or hostile to the Article 7 process. But equally, I don't think it can entirely be abandoned. So it's very hard to predict. But I think maybe we might see a more pragmatic or a more careful attitude. And of course, a lot actually depends on Polish politics, particularly because Poland has presidential elections coming up next year. If the governing party loses the presidency, then its margin for manoeuvre may be constrained, and there are divisions within the Law and Justice Party. So that's much may depend on how Polish domestic politics plays out. Well, I mean, I think if we were going to make criticisms, we might look back earlier, because, as you say, the European Union is constantly behind the curve. It's constantly playing catch up, and it's hard to see how this will change, because the enlargement process really assumes that all new members are democracies. They've been assessed under the Copenhagen criteria before accession talks begin. And the possibility that there would be kind of serious issues around not just the odd violation of the rule of law, but the possible backsliding of democracy into sort of something halfway between liberal democracy and authoritarianism was never really anticipated, and this is where the problem lies. Otherwise, I think the European Union is in a difficult position, that populist governing parties can indeed argue that they're being pressurized and unfairly treated, and it's an example of colonialism. And I mean, as the criticism directed at Timmermans when by the Polish government and others, that he didn't understand Central and Eastern Europe, he was biased against their conservative views and so on. So it can indeed backfire. I think the basic strategy that will have to be followed is that while there can be some pressure, and while the European Union naturally needs to enforce its own rules, they really need to let domestic politics take its course. That really there has to be political change within Poland, there has to be some kind of accommodation between left and right, and probably there has to be the emergence of a kind of conservative right-wing politics which isn't intent on dismantling or taking over institutions. And I think quite how to steer that, or whether it's really a matter of just waiting for things to play out, is a very hard question to answer. That's a very difficult question to answer. I think it depends quite what happens. I think it also depends on the politician. I think if you are a socialist, or if you're a German politician particularly, then I think you have to be quite careful in intervening or appearing to intervene in Polish politics. I think in general, the default position should probably be not to do that, to let the European Union institutions and policies take their course, simply because of the perception of big West European countries interfering in the politics of small and medium-sized Central and East European countries. So it probably should be the exception and not the rule. Okay, well, the idea is really many people see populism in Western Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe as a kind of right-wing, conservative, illiberal force. But most political scientists see populism in slightly different terms as an anti-elite ideology which sees politics in moral terms. The elites are bad people and ordinary people are good. And it can therefore have many different ideological forms. It can be on the left, on the anti-capitalist left, but it can also be kind of oddly in the centre and combined with appeals to managerial efficiency. And Andrej Babiš, although he's kind of quite pragmatic in his rhetoric, his main claim is that he's a businessman and that he will run the Czech Republic along business-like lines. He'll run the country like a firm. He's not obviously nationalistic. He's a Slovak, so it's hard for him to be a Czech nationalist. He's not obviously anti-communist. He has a background in the communist nomenclatura. So technocratic populism means combining the appeals of top-down management by so-called independent experts with a view of politics which says we have to sweep away the old parties and take on corrupt elites. The demonstrations were very big, and they took place on a national scale, so beyond the capital outside Prague. But in fact, Czechs have taken to the streets in quite large numbers before. For example, in 1999, on the 10th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, and they always take to the streets when it appears that there's a sort of threat to the country's democracy, or political parties are corruptly trying to rig the system. And that's a pattern we can see elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. Central and East Europeans are really quite willing to take to streets in large numbers to protest when they think there's corruption, and there's bad governance. So it's not really something new now. No, I mean, it depends on the election, of course. And so, for example, in Poland, the most recent election, participation went up very markedly because it was seen as a decisive election which would shape the country's future political direction. In general, conventional participation, voting, joining political parties has been declining. In a few cases, we can see that there are new parties kind of bubbling up from the grassroots, which have their origins in these civic protest movements. So the party Progressive Slovakia, for example, has its roots in the civic movement, which was launched last year after the assassination of investigative journalist and his partner. And in Romania as well, there's a liberal party which has emerged from anti-corruption protests. But so far, these have been quite small scale. So on the whole, the answer seems to be no.